When we had this conference 9 years ago, the focus was primarily on peace building on the international front, in different international arenas. And as we came to do the follow-up to this conference, as peacemakers and trauma specialists and from some other disciplines, it became abundantly clear to us that a lot of the conflict in the world, or not a lot, but certainly conflict in the world and trauma is based in this country and in the socio-political situation which it finds itself at this time. And so to have that as an integral part of this conference. So to that end, it is my great honor to present to you your speaker at lunchtime, Dr. Monnica Williams. Dr. Williams is, as you can see, presently assistant professor at the University of Connecticut and formerly at the University of Louisville. She truly gives meaning to the idea of diverse training and multitasking. So in terms of her education, she originally obtained her BS as an electrical engineer from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, kind of a low-brow kind of school. And then went on to retrain and obtain her MA and her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of California, Los Angeles. She has done extensive research and also worked clinically in a variety of areas. She has over 75 published articles and published chapters and peer review articles on a variety of topics, including obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety disorders, mood disorders, and post-traumatic stress disorder. More recently, her research has gone to look at the trauma of racism and seeing racism as a true factor in both the disparities in mental health and also looking at ways to eliminate racism. She presently also writes in her spare time a blog for Psychology Today entitled Culturally Speaking. And in reviewing her blog, her comment, one of the comments on the blog, I think kind of summarizes the way I perceive this. She says, using the science of social connection to eliminate racism, and kind of where her research has gone. In addition to her research, she works, has a lab at the University of Connecticut, is the director of the Laboratory for Culture and Disparities, and also has a clinical practice still running back in Kentucky, a clinical facility. So a woman of many talents and many jobs. Welcome, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction and making me feel so welcome here. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here to talk about, I think, this really important topic, race-based stress and trauma. So I'm coming at this from the perspective of a clinical psychologist. I'm also, licensed to practice in Kentucky and Pennsylvania. And in addition to coming at this as a scientist and as a clinician, I'm also bringing in my perspective as an African-American woman, which basically puts me at the bottom of the socio-cultural hierarchy, in our society. So I speak from my own experience in that way. So I am a new faculty at University of Connecticut. I recently left the University of Louisville, where I was actually the first tenured minority woman in that department's 108-year history, which I know is like way too long. So I'm proud of that achievement, but probably my most proud achievement is being deemed an enemy of white America by the white supremacist group, Council of Concerned Citizens of America. So I guess I've picked up the right kind of attention for my work. All right. All right, a couple of warnings before we get started. Given that all audiences that I have presented this sort of material to have reported that it can be difficult at some times, I just want you to know that I make some assumptions about you. They're all good assumptions, so don't worry. That if you experience discomfort, it's because you're probably a very caring, empathetic person, and you're least likely to offend others and you want to avoid harm, or you've been exposed to racism either personally or in your environment, and you're here also because you care about people and you want to do better. So, I want you all to know that I have nothing but good thoughts about all of you. Also, as we go, I'm going to be giving a lot of examples, mostly African American examples, because that's what I study, but a lot of the things I talk about could apply to other stigmatized minority groups as well, so keep that in mind. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about a few examples that I've seen of racial trauma from my clinical practice, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the factors that lead up to those things. One example that comes to mind right away is a young African-American businessman who was asked by law enforcement to pull over his Mercedes-Benz at a federal checkpoint on the outskirts of El Paso, Texas. They were asking to inspect his vehicle, and as he's considering their request, he starts to shake and sweat. And instead of stopping, he speeds away. 10 police cars chase him across the desert, 90 miles across the desert. And when they finally catch him, he's handcuffed and charged with a felony for evading police. And this is actually not a picture of that chase. This is from Thelma and Louise, but the closest facsimile I could find. And we'll get back to him. A few other examples. A 48-year-old African-American woman who can no longer work at her VA job. So at one point, there was a bomb threat in her office, and everyone was told, except her, and she didn't find out till she showed up for work and no one else was there. So that was really frightening for her, and after enduring years of bad experiences like this and ongoing harassment from her boss, she filed a complaint, only to be transferred to another job location an hour away. The perpetrator was not punished, and she had found herself suffering increasingly from depression and anxiety, even having a panic attack when approaching the parking lot of her building. So once an exemplary employee, she's now disabled. A 39-year-old African-American engineer with no criminal history is traveling on business and gets stopped by customs on the way back into the U.S. for a random inspection. They take him into a holding room where they dump out his bags, rifle through his personal belongings, and when he asks the inspector to please put the items back in the bag, the inspector refuses. So the man inexplicably reaches over and slaps the inspector. He's tackled by several officers, arrested, and charged with felony assault, and subsequently fired from his engineering job. A 40-year-old Liberian American woman struggling with mental illness is approached by police in a parking lot. She's seen police harass many African immigrants in her community, and she's really afraid. And when told to stop, she runs. She even grabs a bystander and hides behind the bystander, and when they finally are able to restrain her, she fights back. And as a result, she's charged with assaulting a police officer and booked. And she was held in jail for over a year. Last month we got her out. And then finally, a 70-year-old man sits on death row for stabbing the mother of his son to death. He can't remember the details of the crime, but he can remember the day Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black boy, was hung and castrated for whistling at a white woman as they had bundled cotton in the very same barn. And this is a picture of the maximum security facility in the middle of nowhere in Arizona. Not a nice place. All right, so what do these folks all have in common? They're all suffering from race-based trauma, which has taken a toll on their lives in a very, very real, very tragic way. And these are all true stories. They're all real people. They're all people that I've worked with or tried to help in some way. What is race-based trauma? It's a cluster of symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. So PTSD symptoms typically include intrusive thoughts about the trauma, avoidance of thoughts or reminders of the trauma, anxiety, nightmares, concerns about safety, feeling constantly on guard, feeling fears of being judged because of the trauma, and depression. Individuals may also have flashbacks, feelings of dissociation or memory loss. Very severe PTSD can result in psychosis, and PTSD can be temporarily or permanently disabling. Symptoms specific to race-based trauma may also include avoidance of people in the ethnic or racial group of the person who may have perpetrated against you, fears and anxiety in the presence of triggering groups like law enforcement, paranoia and suspicion, and excessive worries about the safety of family and friends. So over the last 15 years, we've really started to amass quite a strong and convincing body of research linking discrimination to a host of very negative mental health consequences, including stress, PTSD, serious psychological distress, depression, binge drinking, binge eating, and even psychosis and schizophrenia, not to mention a number of physical health problems as well. One thing that seems to buffer against some of these negative outcomes are things like a very strong positive ethnic minority identity, unless the discriminatory events are severe, in which case even a strong ethnic identity is not going to necessarily protect a person from some of these negative outcomes. Okay, who experiences racism and discrimination? Well, research shows that by and large, African Americans in our culture receive more discrimination than other ethnic and racial groups. However, these other groups like Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans receive a great deal of discrimination as well. So it seems like there's plenty of discrimination to go around. The way that discrimination affects groups may differ by ethnic background. For example, Hispanic Americans who experience racism were more likely to have symptoms of major depressive disorder, whereas African Americans were more likely to have symptoms of PTSD. Additionally, the darker a person's skin, the more likely they are to experience racism, which is also called colorism. And now who perpetrates and suffers from racism? So people of any group can perpetrate racism and discrimination against any other group, including other minority groups, women, sexual minorities, disabled persons, etc. And anyone of any race can suffer as a result of racism and discrimination. However, to discriminate, in order for discrimination to generally be meaningful and impactful in all the bad ways that it is, the perpetrator has to have some degree of power over the victim. For example, white over black. I mean, power can be social power. It doesn't have to be power that's technically given to someone like a boss over an employee, but it can be, or men over women. Also, research shows that some groups are more likely to be racist than others, and these are some results from the implicit attitudes test, which you may be familiar with. It's a measure of implicit bias, and these are the results of having people take this test and comparing their attitudes about blacks versus whites, where 1 indicates the strongest preference for white, and -1 is the strongest preference for African American, and 0 is no bias. And what we see from data from thousands and thousands of people all over the country is that most people have some bias. Generally, males have more bias than females. Non-Hispanics have more bias than Hispanics, but not by much. And in terms of race, African Americans actually have very little bias, and white Americans are actually the most biased group. So although there are individual differences in who is biased, by and large, on average, we can predict that some groups are going to be more biased than others. Some people don't like that I say that, Sorry, that's just the research. All right, and actually some places are more racist than others as well. And here's a map of the country based on the results of these IAT scores. And first I should point out that all of these areas show bias, a white preference, but some show more than others, which is indicated with red. So you can see that in the South, there's a lot more bias than in some, other states. Like, you guys in Colorado, you're not so bad. Don't go to Mississippi. Yeah, and we also find that in these regions, more racism is actually associated with greater mortality in Black people. So here was another similar study done actually using Google data, where they looked at where queries were coming from that used the N-word. So, you might argue, well, maybe the IAT isn't really measuring racism, but this actually does seem to very clearly be measuring racism, and we find really a lot of the same things, a lot of racism in the South, and then there's this strip in the Appalachians. And what they found is that Black mortality rates are actually significantly correlated to these areas where there's greater racism. Black mortality from things like heart disease, cancer, and stroke. So there does seem to be a real effect of racism, both physically and mentally, on people of color. All right, so let's break down what we mean when we talk about racism. There's actually a couple different types of racism that social psychologists like to describe. So we have the traditional dominative racism, and that's what most people think about when we talk about racism, that old-fashioned racism that says, I don't like you because you're Black and you're inferior, and all that bad stuff, and think of people running around in white hoods and so forth. But that more blatant type of discrimination is really kind of, out of fashion. And we have kind of newer forms of racism that have replaced this by and large. Symbolic or modern racism, and that's a sort of racism where people might say, well, it's not that I don't like you because you're a person of color, but it's like your culture. There's like why do Black people have to be so loud and wear hoodies, and things like this. And then there's aversive racism, and this is really a type of racism you see more in venues like this, where you have kind of highly educated people who may say, oh, I'm not racist, but they still maybe have some conflicted or negative feelings toward minorities that may be conscious or unconscious. And then we have microaggressions, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, but these are small, subtle acts of racism, which often spring from these attitudes, where the person who is the victim or the target of the microaggression or the small racist act is not even sometimes sure that racism was committed, but they're kind of anxious and worried and thinking about it. And then also we have the concept of ethnoviolence, which is like racism. It's violence and intimidation that's directed at marginalized and stigmatized members of an ethnic group because of their inability or unwillingness to assimilate. And so they're seen as threatening the dominant group's entitlement to society and community resources. And so people in this group are treated as symbols of undesirable cultural practices. So whereas racism uses appearance as a way of classifying people, the ethnoviolence is due to their culture or regional origins. And then, these two things can be conflated as well. But in either case, both racism and ethnoviolence can lead to traumatization. And so here's some examples of racism. And there's a whole span of things that can be racist acts, large acts, small acts. Being followed in stores, also known as shopping while Black. So, and so lots of people I know have had this experience where they've been followed in stores, or even had one good friend of mine who's also an African American professor. He was in a store where they had some nice clothes, and the cashier came up to him while he was looking at the clothes and said, "Oh, everything in here is really expensive. I don't think you're going to find anything here you want." So, yeah, things like that. Cashiers asking for extra identification, so there may be some written policy that if you use a check or credit card, they have to check your ID, but it may only be selectively implemented with people of color. Insensitive remarks by coworkers or friends, and so this can really be painful because these may be people that, that I care about and respect, and then they may be saying things that are hurtful to me or other people of color. Profiling by law enforcement. So, for example, my dad, he had a beige Mercedes well, he didn't have a beige Mercedes, his wife did, but he would drive it sometimes. And whenever he drove it, he would get pulled over by police who assumed that, oh, a black man in a beige Mercedes, that can't possibly be his car, he must have stolen it. And so he got pulled over so often in that car, he just stopped driving it because he just didn't have time to be late for work all the time. Racial slurs, so that's kind of an obvious one. Confederate monuments, right? So things in the environment that, that celebrate people who wanted to keep people like me enslaved. We'll talk more about that. Threats, so racism can be threats against people. Here's some other examples of racism. All lives matter. In case you're wondering, yes, I'm going to go there, right? So what's the problem with that, right? Don't all lives matter? Well, the problem is that Black Lives Matter is an affirmation of inclusion of Black life, not intended to be excluding of others. And the All Lives Matter hashtag, it communicates that efforts to focus the problem of Black lives being lost is not important and not worthy of public discussion or action. And so it's very invalidating in the face of real problem. And others. So anyway, exposure to racism can result in psychological affliction, behavioral exhaustion, and physiological distress. It tends to wound a healthy sense of self-worth and impairs coping because racism often causes confusion, disillusionment, and racial mistrust. So the things that push people apart. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about microaggressions. Here's an example, right? These are, I don't see you as black, you're more like a regular person. Thank you so much for elevating me to a regular person. So targets of, so these again are small racist acts that are not always clearly racially motivated. Sometimes they're clear. And they create uncertainty and anxiety in minorities because we're forced to ascertain whether or not the person who perpetrated this act actually did something that was racist. And so this ambiguity and uncertainty is stressful. And it differs from overt discrimination because if you can say, okay, that person said and did that because they're a racist, well, that provides a reason and a context for the behavior. Whereas this sort of leaves, again, that hanging uncertainty about what was that really about. And so microaggressions, there's lots of different kinds of microaggressions. They don't have to be statements. They can be actions. Here's an example right here. We have Joe Black Man walking down the street. We have Joe White Man walking down the street. Joe Black Man does not have on a hoodie or any weapons as far as I can tell, but Joe White Man spontaneously crosses the street. So what just happened there, right? We don't really know for sure. We don't know for sure, but I mean, he could have been like going, oh, black person, I'm going to cross, get away from him. Or he could be going to the store over here. So it's hard to know for sure, but imagine for a minute, indulge me, imagine that you are Joe Black Man here, and you see this thing happen to you, and it doesn't just happen once, but it like happens every day. Then what might you start to think or feel in the face of having an experience like this happen to you very regularly? And often when I pose this question, one of the first things people say is, well, maybe that makes him angry. And it is possible that could make someone angry. That makes a lot of sense. But But one response that I often don't hear right away is, well, maybe it makes him sad, right? Maybe this guy has a really tender heart, and this kind of hurts his feelings. And it's interesting that people don't think about that first, because again, our stereotypes about black people, particularly black men, make it easy to project emotions like anger onto them, when in fact, black men have all the same emotions that everybody else has. So in any case, this could hurt a person's feelings, and if it's happening a lot, it could wound their sense of self and their self-esteem. Here's some other examples. This is a hypothetical faculty meeting with a hypothetical person I'll call Maria. And we'll say this is the chair. And she says, I want to be sure we are recognizing all the stellar contributions of our wonderful faculty. And Maria says, hey, I got an article in JAMA and an APA Early Career Award, and the New York Times is doing a feature on my new clinic for race-based stress and trauma. And then another faculty says, I'm judging the science fair at Manual High School. And then the other faculty is like, way to go, Adam. And the chair says, good job, Adam. Let's post that on the department webpage. Right? So sometimes sometimes microaggressions can be just ignoring someone, right? Making them feel invisible or not there or less than. Yeah, so he says thanks. And she says splendid. Okay. All right. Microaggressions can even happen in therapy, right? So what if the doctor or the therapist says to the patient or client, I'm not sure we need to focus on race or culture to understand your depression. What kind of message might that transmit to a person of color who maybe has come for help for depression and thinks that maybe it's because of racism they're experiencing? Well, I think that person might be left thinking might be hearing the message that the clinician is saying, well, I know better than you, and racism is not harmful, which I think also really kind of illustrates the clinician's own discomfort with the idea that racism and mental health could be linked. And also, really, how can the therapist know if racism is the cause if they don't even listen to the client and take the time to find out what's going on for them, right? So this client is going to very quickly learn that the therapist is not going to take him seriously, or her. Or how about this statement, right? Which I'm sure was meant in the kindest way possible, but the response is, let's hope you weren't treated that way due to racism. And so this is really a dismissal that fails to acknowledge the reality of racial discrimination as a problem in our society, and it tells the client that discussion of racism is not going to be heard, and it's not a valid reason for mistreatment. So it may also communicate that the racist behaviors from others are in fact the fault of the client, in other words, blaming the victim and not the person who actually perpetrated the act. So this may be communicating the message that your experience upsets me and I don't want to hear it, and maybe the problem was not racism, just you. So definitely not validating. And here's another example that kind of hits close to home. So me and my colleagues and our whole university were very embarrassed by a photo that emerged from a campus-themed Mexican-themed Halloween party last year, featuring the university president dressed in a sombrero and colorful poncho, and the executive staff sporting bushy mustaches and strange veils. And so this picture was actually picked up by all the major media outlets, including Fox News, The Washington Post, USA Today, and Huffington Post, who were not impressed with this. So although many of us are now aware that ethnically and racially themed Halloween parties are potentially offensive to the targets of those, nobody in that particular office was knowledgeable or empowered enough to speak up to prevent this disaster from happening. And I actually subsequently met with the university leaders and provided a training on microaggressions to the president's office. And I want to point out that this kind of embarrassing and hurtful incident illustrates what can happen when institutions neglect to have a really good plan in place for diversity training of their leaders. And I think it also sends a message to people of color that if bad things happen to them, they won't be listened to or respected, because this is what we think of you, right? Students initially arranged a meeting with the university president to discuss their feelings about what became known as Sombrero Gate. And they reported that he didn't seem to listen, and he left early because he had another meeting with like UPS or somebody. And the students felt like their concerns were unimportant, which only worsened the situation and turned what could have been a small problem into a much larger one, feeling distrust at the institution. One student said that the president, quote, did not want to listen to us, and he was not interested in the context of what was going on. I felt very let down by the leader of this university. And so consider that it's very difficult for those in vulnerable positions like students to know how to respond to racism inflicted by faculty due to traditional hierarchies that may create fear, worries about retaliation, perceived lack of accountability, and hopelessness about change. And so students may be reluctant to complain to a department chair or ombudsman who's probably also white, and if they approach the offending faculty member or a colleague about racial issues, that people of color may find themselves misunderstood or even attacked by defensive others. So these things can really be serious, and not just a fun party. And here's another example of a microaggression. I mentioned Confederate monuments. So this is a monument that was built in 1895, and it's 70 feet tall and located at a busy intersection in Louisville on 2nd and 3rd Streets. It's the largest Civil War monument in Kentucky, made of granite with German-designed Confederate soldiers made of bronze. Owned by the city of Louisville, the monument commemorates or celebrates the sacrifice of Confederate veterans. The campus is kind of grown around the monument, and I think it's important to point out that this memorial celebrates courage and valor of Confederate soldiers, but it's also a painful reminder to those of us with a cultural memory of the horrors of slavery, right? So keep in mind that the leader of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, had this to say about my people after the Civil War, that African slavery as it exists in the United States is a moral, social, and political blessing. And you can't transform the Negro into 1/10 as useful or good as what slavery enables them to be. So what message might this memorial communicate to people like myself, and also considering that the parking lot was over here and my building was over here, and I had to walk by that thing every day. So if these folks had won the war, which actually a lot of people in the South will say that they wish that the Confederacy won the war, I and my whole family would still be slaves. So actually during the aforementioned diversity training at the university's executive office, I explained how this monument affected me personally as an African American and how stressful it was to see this all the time. This is a picture of Corey Menifee, an African American service worker at Yale, where this issue of environmental microaggressions recently played out after much debate over racist imagery on campus. He broke a stained glass window depicting smiling slaves carrying baskets of cotton. Here are those happy smiling slaves. And in explanation of his actions, he said, as you look at it, it just hurts. You feel it in your heart, like, oh man, like here in the 21st century, you know we're in a modern era where we shouldn't have to be subjected to these primitive and degrading images. The university officials struggled with how to respond to the situation. So he was fired originally and charged with felony mischief, but then subsequently rehired after some extended controversy and protest under the condition that he would not speak out about the case, so he was silenced. And although the event was framed as vandalism by some and activism by others, I actually think that it's more accurate to conceptualize his actions as a traumatic reaction to being forced to work in a racially hostile environment. So as we think about trauma, keep in mind that trauma, we're really starting to move away from the idea that becoming traumatized is something that happens from one thing that happens to you. And really, it seems to be that cumulative trauma is more the rule than the exception. One study that was done in Detroit found that any history of previous exposure to traumatic events was associated with a greater risk of PTSD from the so-called defined index trauma. And multiple previous events had a stronger effect than a single previous event, which is consistent with the idea of a sensitization hypothesis, in that the more trauma you experience, the more likely you are to eventually become traumatized. So what does this mean for stigmatized minorities? I'm getting there. So racism-related trauma is probably better conceptualized as a reaction to cumulative small traumas, and maybe a few big ones too. So for most traumatic experiences, people may show signs of re-experiencing or intrusion of the event. And in the case of race-based traumatic stress, these encounters may be clustered or cumulative, and it could be that a last straw event may serve as the trigger for the trauma. So in other words, you may be stressed, having to deal with all this stuff, but the level of stress may not reach the threshold for turning into being traumatized until this trigger or last straw, which could be a major event or could be a minor event. And most minorities will tell you that their stress is not because of one event, but because of a series of these emotional wounds and blows. Additionally, trauma can be inherited. So, so new research has showed that it's not just social transmission, but there's also a biological inheritance piece that can be a big factor as well. So, for example, in the journal Nature, Diaz and colleagues explained a study where mice learned to associate the smell of a cherry blossom with an electric shock. And something really interesting happened to these mice. These were male mice, by the way. And the children and even some of the grandchildren of those original male mice who were shocked actually had a freak-out reaction or traumatic reaction when exposed to the same odor, even though they had never received the shock themselves. So despite never having encountered the smell of a cherry blossom, the offspring of the mice had the same fearful and traumatic response to the smell. So, along the same lines, cultural trauma can be inherited in more ways than one. And we have also these traumatic experiences that have happened to large groups of people in our society, right? We have children and grandchildren, for example, of Holocaust survivors who've been found to be more susceptible to PTSD after controlling for every other thing you can think of to control for. And in fact, they actually identified some biological inherited mechanisms that were correlated to traumatization. Also, cultural trauma exists in descendants of Japanese World War II incarceration victims, and the negative consequences for the identity of those imprisoned and their offspring continue to this day. And then we have a whole Native American experience, which included genocide and all that bad stuff. And we see to this day high rates of addiction, suicide, mental illness, sexual violence, etc., which may also be connected to historical trauma. And then within the African American traumatic cultural history, we've got kidnapping from Africa, slavery, socially sanctioned rape, Jim Crow, and segregation, marginalization and discrimination into current times, also termed post-traumatic slave syndrome by Leary. And so the cultural trauma is a real thing, and Kira says that one problem is that most interventions that are designed to help people who've had a single trauma ignore the cumulative trauma dynamics as well as the collective identity and culture-specific traumas. So this is an important piece that we can't neglect to consider. So in summary, race-based stress and trauma can include stress from racism, which can be discrimination, harassment, discriminatory harassment, microaggressions, which are an ongoing low-level stressor, and then this cultural trauma, which has historical pieces and ongoing pieces in terms of community traumas going on in the community, like shooting of unarmed black men. And these racist events and racist incidents are traumatic, right? So if we think about how an individual racist event can cause trauma, keep in mind, we could think of it as an analogy to rape, right? So they affect survivors in the same way that rape and domestic violence can. For example, the act is a violation of an individual's personhood. The person feels disempowered or powerless. The event is unpredictable and uncontrollable. You never know when it's going to happen. And then the icing on the cake is that it may be challenged or ridiculed by others when a person tries to talk about it. And people in both cases, in terms of rape, domestic violence, and racism, survivors may be made to feel shame over allowing themselves to feel victimized. And then when you feel shame, you don't want to talk about it, and then that kind of cuts off an avenue for healthy coping with what happened to you. Okay, so here's an example from the literature. Alan was a young African-American man working at a retail store. Though he enjoyed and valued his job, he struggled with the way he was treated by his employer. He was frequently demeaned, given menial tasks, and even required to track African-American customers in the store to make sure they weren't stealing. Alan began to suffer from symptoms of depression, generalized anxiety, low self-esteem, and feelings of humiliation. After filing a complaint, he was threatened by his boss and then fired. Alan's symptoms worsened. He had intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, difficulty concentrating, irritability, and jumpiness, all hallmarks of PTSD. He later sued his employer for job-related discrimination, and 5 employees also supported his allegations, and he was found to be suffering from race-based trauma. So that's an example of trauma in the workplace. So PTSD is a severe and chronic condition that can occur in response to any traumatic event. Now, in the DSM-5, which is sort of our guidelines for how we diagnose and classify mental disorders, there have been some recent changes in the last edition, where previously a person was required to have directly experienced a discrete traumatic event for a diagnosis. But under the new criteria, if a person has learned about a traumatic event involving a close friend or family member, or if the person is repeatedly exposed to details about a trauma, they may be eligible for a diagnosis. These changes were made to include people who are exposed in their occupational fields, like police officers or EMTs, but the way I see it, this can also be very applicable to those suffering from the cumulative effects of racism as well. What we see with epidemiological studies is that the prevalence rate of PTSD is higher in blacks than non-Hispanic whites, and we also see increased rates of PTSD in Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, and Southeast Asian refugees. And so one reason that minorities may be experiencing more PTSD could be due to the effect of racism, which continues to be an unfortunate part of American life. The experience of discrimination has an overwhelming impact on the oppressed, including well-documented negative physical and mental health outcomes that I reviewed earlier. And also, research seems to indicate that PTSD may be more disabling for minorities. For example, African Americans with PTSD have far more impairment at work and difficulty carrying out everyday activities as a result of the disorder. So here's a little model that kind of illustrates how this happens. You have a racist event, which is again a negative, unexpected, uncontrollable violation or assault to one's personhood, followed by a traumatic reaction, in other words, shock, disbelief, fear, shame, humiliation, and confusion. And this may be exacerbated by cumulative smaller assaults, resulting in symptoms such as re-experiencing, avoidance, negative mood and cognitions, and physiological arousal, which are all defining components of PTSD. And so that's how we can conceptualize that it may fit into a DSM-5 framework. So I'm going to tell you a little more about Clarence's story. That was the first example I mentioned today with the young black man who was chased in the desert. So a little bit about his background. He attended college, actually right here in Colorado, where he received a 2-year business degree with a minor in theater. He served in the United States Air Force for 3 years and was honorably discharged. He owns his own athletic clothing company and has several employees. He does motivational speaking. He's an activist. He saves 10% of his earnings. He has no history of drug use and no prior involvement with the legal system up until that event. As a black man in America, Clarence also experienced a fair amount of discrimination. He has seen people get shot, beaten up, and he's witnessed police brutality on more occasions than he could count. He described one incident from his youth on Independence Day where he and his friends were at an event and the police came up and tased one of the kids for no reason. So these experiences fuel his activism. In 2014, during the unrest in Ferguson, he felt troubled by what he saw happening on the news, and he wanted to make sure that the other black people there were not being exploited by police and that they knew their rights. We went there. He connected with a group called Lost Voices, where he says he worked to let the world know what was really going on. He reported that he and 1,000 people marched to the local police station to protest the situation there, and that the police threw a noose at them as a form of harassment. He said the mentality of the police was oppressive, and that he described them as acting like slave owners. He stayed there for a few weeks and then had to leave as the situation continued to escalate. So he's been harassed by police many times, pulled over and searched for no reason other than driving while black. He's got, again, a nice car that he's earned through hard work. And when I asked him the last time he experienced discrimination, he told me about a situation where he and a friend were sitting in his car outside of a Verizon store, and a police officer came over to them and said, "Hey, did you just rob that store?" And I said, "When did that happen?" He said, "Yesterday." So these things happen to him all the time. And so what happened on that day he was arrested? So he had planned to meet with some business colleagues in El Paso, but was diverted to another area due to a change in schedule. And he was stopped at a federal checkpoint and ordered by the officer on duty to pull to the side for his car to be searched. And so he was not comfortable and did not want to be searched, and he thought it was his right to refuse being searched without probable cause, and he viewed the request as the product of racial profiling. Also, he had a gun in his trunk. It was lawful and registered in his name, but he knew all too well the sorts of things police might think or do to black men. Just watch the news, right? So he started to sweat and panic, and something took over, and he didn't pull over, instead he sped away. And 10 police vehicles began chasing him, and then he really got scared. And as he sped through the desert, his whole life flashed before his eyes, and he said he thought he didn't want it to end that way. He kept driving, looking for the first sign of civilization, because he thought maybe he'd be less likely to get killed if there were witnesses. And after continuing to drive and not finding any cities or towns, in desperation, he called 911. He told the operator, quote, "I'm being chased by your police. All I'm trying to do is get to civilization so they won't gun me down." Somehow she convinced him to stop the car, and Clarence was suddenly surrounded by 30 armed men with guns. And he thought, okay, I'm gonna die. He raised his hands to surrender, and they pulled him from his car. And he wondered also if the police were perhaps recognized him as an activist from Ferguson. He hoped they didn't. At the police station, he was booked, drug tested. He had about $1,000 cash on him, which was taken from him, and he was charged with a felony. He served 3 weeks in a federal prison with hardened criminals and drug traffickers. And they were like, "What are you doing here?" He was eventually released on bail, and his lawyer reached out to me to conduct the psychological evaluation to help explain his behaviors at that checkpoint. And he was found to be suffering from race-based trauma. So racism is not typically considered traumatic by mental health care providers. And Psychological difficulties attributed to racist experiences are often questioned or minimized, a response that only perpetuates the victim's anxieties. And victims may be further traumatized by microaggressions from their own therapists if they're going to get help when they encounter disbelief or avoidance of racially charged material. So how do we help people like Clarence? And so this is a little diagram of what racial trauma is like. So you already have this low-level cultural trauma, which includes this historical traumas and community traumas, and the stress of ongoing racism. And then eventually you may have a traumatic event that happens that pushes a person over from being stressed into being traumatized. And again, it can be a big thing or it can be a small thing. And then they struggle with invalidation as they try to talk about what happened to them. And they may struggle also with institutional racism or barriers to recovery, which only makes the traumatization worse as they're not able to find adequate help for their problem for a number of economic or social reasons. So those of us in helping professions, it's really important for us to understand that most minorities have already encountered discrimination in other contexts and may be mistrustful when they come for treatment or help. And so it's important that we acknowledge and validate their mistrust. And one way we can do that also is by asking them about their experiences with other professionals. And raising the issue early is important because it conveys cultural sensitivity and may address concerns about a racially different clinician. Sometimes people say, well, maybe it wouldn't just be easier to just match clients to someone, to a therapist or other professional of the same racial and ethnic background, which, I mean, that's great if you can do it. But given the demographics of the field, at least in my profession, there's like less than, 2 to 5% black psychologists. I mean, in Kentucky, you can count all of us on one hand. So it's not always easy to find somebody that's of your own group. Additionally, having a minority therapist doesn't guarantee a culturally competent approach, right? Even if that therapist may be at an advanced stage of their own ethnic and racial identity development, you may still not get culturally competent treatment because we as clinicians, even the minority ones, are usually trained by white people who are operating from a Eurocentric perspective using Eurocentric methods, which are empirically supported therapies that have been tested and validated on white people. So the treatments that we use that we think of as gold standard treatments may not be appropriate for people from other racial and ethnic groups. So we have to think a little more clearly about how we're going to address this problem. And these are some of the biggest problems that we're facing right now in terms of moving forward in this area in my profession is that problem number one, existing PTSD measures, which may be aimed at identifying that index trauma, typically fail to include racism among the choice response options, and so it leaves these events to be reported as other or squeezed into a category where they may not fit. Problem two is that minorities may be reluctant to volunteer experiences of racism to white clinicians, who are the majority of mental health care providers, because they may worry that the clinician won't understand them or become defensive or may express disbelief. And then finally, minority clients may not link their PTSD symptoms to the cumulative experiences of discrimination if asked about a single event. And in fact, so many of us put up with so many of these things all the time, they just sometimes feel normal. And we actually forget sometimes that we're being mistreated. Okay, but the current realities of our society keep us from being able to forget some of these unpleasant facts, right? So considering, for example, that in 2015, police killed over 100 unarmed black people. So that's nearly 2 a week. And I don't think that this was by accident, that this happened. I think we have to really consider we have to consider the bigger sociocultural picture here. So one primary factor in the development of the police force in America was the institution of slavery and the desire to control indigenous populations, which was accomplished through things like slave patrols and night watches. For example, in New England, settlers appointed Indian constables to police Native Americans, and many Southern police departments began as slave patrols for wealthy landowners, where their job was to recover and punish slaves who tried to escape. It's been noted that the similarities between the slave patrols and American policing are just far too salient to dismiss or ignore, and hence the slave patrol should be considered a forerunner of modern American law enforcement. Current examples include vigilante groups like the Minutemen, who are heavily armed volunteers that patrol the U.S.-Mexican border. So the legacy of this history is that even today, the majority of police homicides are inflicted upon people of color, notably Native Americans, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans, proportionally. So thus, within many minority communities, there remains a strong cultural memory of these abuses by police culture that extends all the way back from slave patrols to even today, right through the civil rights era and into modern times. And so, as these abuses have not really completely ended by any means, it's difficult for people of color to who've been victims of racial profiling or who've seen disturbing media accounts of police violence to believe that they may feel it's appropriate to be suspicious and fearful of police officers. And so even coming in contact with law enforcement can trigger anxiety and distress. So one of the things clinicians sometimes ask me is how can we measure racial trauma? How can we open up the conversation? I recommend sometimes that people consider using some of these measures with their clients, those of you who do clinical work. There's a number of good tools that are out there to assess this. Some self-report measures, which I have some of these in my initial battery for new clients if they're minorities, and it can really kind of help give a good early picture of issues and difficulties that you can address in therapy. Also, Carter and colleagues developed the race-based traumatic stress symptom scale, which is really, I think which is a really good measure. And there's also some clinician-administered interviews. There's the DSM-5 cultural formulation interview. To the back of the DSM-5, if you didn't know it was there, it's there. Although interestingly, the one thing they didn't cover in that interview is the experience of racism and discrimination. So I have a survey that I've developed that's an interview that can also be used to assess racial trauma as well. And we have that in English and Spanish. Okay. So here's another example of how these things can impact a person. This person says, I try my best to hide my feelings as I walk through the halls and sidewalks of the Health Science Center. But deep down, I feel like I, as a black male, do not belong in the U.S. I'm a man in a foreign land, and as a result, I feel out of place standing for the national anthem at sporting events or graduations because I just don't feel that the America referenced in that song is my story. I feel the land of the free is some faraway land because it seems to be socially acceptable for people who look like me to be subservient in this America, right? So how do we help folks like that? What can helping professionals do, and what can sufferers do? And so the very first thing I want to tell people is if somebody talks to you about an experience of racism and discrimination, you want to believe them, right? So this is a very important moment for healing and growth. If a person of color is chosen to engage, typically a white person, in a vulnerable interpersonal interaction, they are often doing this with fears of being misunderstood or even becoming the target of more prejudice. And so again, this is where our science of social connection can help us. The white listener may fear being seen as prejudiced, which makes it harder for the interaction to succeed, and it's really crucial that the listener is able to overcome these fears and biases and respond well in that moment. Positive intergroup interactions predict psychological recovery from stressful intergroup interactions for people of color, and the success of this interaction depends in large part to the ability of the listener to demonstrate accurate empathy and understanding. So this is not the time for Socratic questioning. You want to validate and and not question the person's experience. And keep in mind, you weren't there, so as a stigmatized minority who was present for the event, the victim is really in the best position to determine if a racist event occurred and then how they were harmed by it. And then other ways that you can be helpful include things like helping identify strengths and supports, and often there are cultural strengths and supports that shouldn't be overlooked, like pride in culture and extended family, traditional celebrations, cultural activities. We've done a little bit of research on this in terms of trying to see how people cope when they anticipate racism. I have a student who did like a really, really clever experiment where he had people watch a video of someone that they thought they were going to have to interact with as a partner in a multicultural class who kept saying all these racist things. And so we really wanted to understand how people cope when they anticipate racism. And I won't go over all the details of this, but a lot of times, but I often do wonder how people do continue to remain resilient in the face of ongoing and undeserved discrimination. And so I think it's important to remember that even though a lot of bad things are happening, there are a lot of positive things too. There's a lot of strengths in the African American culture that promote resilience, such as things like faith, forgiveness, humor, and optimism, that have allowed groups to persevere for centuries, even under the most oppressive conditions. And so my take on how we facilitate adaptive coping is to first place the blame where it belongs, not on the victim, but on the perpetrator, and secondarily our cultural dysfunction, which makes it okay to see people as less than based on their race. And again, this is something embedded in every aspect of our society, so you have to really pay attention, or you start to repeat those patterns. Seek social support within one's community, close friends and family. Limit exposure to cues of racism as needed while recovering. Utilize religious or spiritual practices for comfort, like prayer or meditation. Seek positive distraction from cues of racism, such as pleasurable and meaningful activities. And also rest, self-care. And then finally, I think it's really important to engage in peaceful activism. In other words, a person can make meaning from their pain and use it as a way to bring everybody forward. Really important to avoid harmful coping. And sometimes the emotional weight of racism can lead people to engage in maladaptive coping, such as remaining in denial, engaging in substance use, aggression, self-blame, and even in severe cases, suicide, like we saw with the Black Lives Matter activist Marshawn McCarroll, and terrorism, like the Dallas shooter, Mike Xavier Johnson. And so these responses are harmful, negative, and have long-term consequences. And so people who are finding themselves trapped in some of these strategies are encouraged to get professional help. Sometimes the situation is so bad that you have to make an escape plan, right? So is the trauma still happening? Victims need space to heal. It's really, really hard to heal someone if they're continually assaulted by the same trauma. And so it's important to identify the major sources of stress, make a plan to change the environment, which could mean finding a new job, which I did, move to a new neighborhood if you have to, remove toxic people from your life. Again, these are not easy changes, but sometimes they're necessary. It's important to facilitate empowerment. So on that note, I'm going to just close up again with, actually, these are a few of my own personal coping strategies and my challenges. So again, as a stigmatized minority and a female, I run into discrimination a fair amount. And as if I do interviews for the media, the first thing they always want to know is, oh, did you see the latest video? And I don't really want to see the latest video, but I feel like I have to make an informed commentary. And so these things are stressful for me. And then if I speak out or write, I'm always attacked by lots and lots of racists. So anyone who says it's a post-racial society, no, just read the comments. Or having my work underappreciated by the dominant academic structures, right, that place a higher value on work with white people. And then sometimes I actually have to read or review or comment on racist research. Like I might get asked to do an article review on why blacks are not as smart as whites. And I think to myself, oh my gosh, I don't want to read that. But if I don't do it, someone else might read it and they might put it through. So you feel a lot of responsibility for that. And then teaching difficult diversity courses. These are always challenging because you're sometimes butting up against a whole lifetime of learned wrong ideas. So these are some of the strategies that I use, and they help me. And I think what's really important is thinking about victories and achievements, because it's easy to get overwhelmed and discouraged in the face of all the bad things that happen. And there's lots of victories. So remember that Confederate monument? They're moving it now, so that's a victory. Thank you. I got a better job at a better university, so I don't have to deal with Sombrero Gate. And Clarence's case, the prosecution got a big psychologist to assess him, and he read my report and agreed with me, so the case was dropped. And so these are all real things that we can celebrate. So my final thoughts on this matter is this, that patching up injured victims of racism one by one is important, but only goes so far. And I don't think it's reasonable to expect that we can just fix people to enable them to manage constant ongoing acts of prejudice and smile and be perpetually polite, productive, and forgiving. So I think that's just too much. And what we need really is a large-scale shift in our communities and our social consciousness to really understand the toll this takes on the psyche of victims, so that even small acts of racism become unacceptable. And we need finally those who witness racism to speak out and for victims to be believed. And my agenda is to eliminate racism, and that's what I'm working for. So thank you.
Test. Thank you, Dr. Williams, for your very thorough and inspiring and difficult talk. I had a question about how we can talk about race in a way that respects and validates people's experiences, but doesn't also perpetrate racial categories. So I'm thinking about an example with my friends where we're describing someone that we interacted with before, and I try to name them or describe them without using their racial category. And my friend, who is like me, a person of color, says, why don't you just say she's black? Why don't you just say she's Chinese? That's how you should describe them. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to fall into that trap of racial categories. But I also see her point of not wanting to be colorblind. So I'm always like stuck with this dilemma, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, so I think that part of the problem is that there's sort of this idea that maybe there's something sometimes wrong with being a minority, and I actually like that I'm African American. I like my skin color. I'm proud of my heritage. So I don't want that to be ignored or unseen or invisible. And I think it's also equally important to recognize that although I am also African American, I'm also a human being, so I'm part of the larger world, and then also I'm an individual too. And so I think all three of these aspects of the person are really important. And the problem is that when I think we decide to kind of not talk about race, then that feeds the idea that there's something wrong with it. And I don't want that to be the way the conversation goes. Although I totally understand, of course, the flip side, race isn't even really a real thing. It's just a social convention we made up so that we can decide who's on the top and who's on the bottom. And I think that that also has to be said as well. So yeah, it's tricky, but I think we need to acknowledge both of those things. Does that help?
Hello, Dr. Williams. Thank you again for your presentation. I was trained in the psychology field, but now I move in public health circles. And public health has for a long time been able to point to and name our social determinants of health. And as we hopefully gradually come to a more holistic look at what health is, and that we're no longer trying to separate mind and body anymore, and we see all of those consequences coming together. I'm just wondering how, and if you have had the opportunity to do so, how we might help bridge those two disciplines that are looking at health through different lenses, because I think trauma is one of the elephants in the room at the base of all of the social determinants of health that we're not naming, and the more we could get this language into that setting, I think the better off we'd be in those programs.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's really important. I think it's important for people across disciplines to work together. So, for example, this conference is wonderful because we've got people from so many different disciplines communicating with each other. It's really very easy to get sort of siloed in your own way of thinking. And so I think it's really important to bring in people with expertise in issues like race, ethnicity, and culture to consult, to kind of help you see your blind spots when you're developing interventions and research studies. I think having a diverse team is super important for learning and growth and making sure that the things we do are inclusive.
Right here. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for creating a space for, I think, brave and authentic dialogue versus safe and comfortable dialogue, which is what often happens, right? As I look around the room, we do not represent the demographics of our country, and I think more importantly, we do not represent the demographics of the people we serve, whether here nationally or internationally. And my question, I guess, is how do we, often we know we have these diversity trainings or we have multicultural classes, but that's where the dialogue stops. And there is little in terms of action and integration of diversity in our dialogue. So how do we create that space at universities, at training sites, at clinics, in a way that's authentic and brave like you did today?
Yeah, that's a big question. I don't know that I can answer that in 2 minutes, but I just wrote a paper on that. So I have a lot of thoughts about it, but I'd say that the main thing we have to think about is when we want to bring in more diverse people into our spaces, are we telling them, you diverse people need to assimilate and do things the way we do, or are we willing to say, let's all change and make this a space that's comfortable for everyone, where everybody's contributions and perspectives are recognized and appreciated? So I think it's been too much of the former, not enough of the latter. And so keeping in mind that if we want to really have a diverse space, we also have to be committed individually to change and growth, and that's not easy and it's not comfortable, but it's essential. So.
Thanks for your great talk, Dr. Williams. I appreciated that you mentioned unconscious or implicit bias, which I think is a really pernicious problem because by definition, it's really hard to change, right? If people are not aware that they are racist, how on earth could they decide to try to change that? So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about confronting unconscious bias.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. If you don't know about it, there's not much you can do about it. And I think sometimes, unfortunately, people have sort of taken that whole implicit bias thing and been like, oh, well, we all have implicit bias, oh well, can't help it. And clearly that's not the right answer. So I think a big part of it is first becoming conscious of it and really kind of taking a fearless look at your own life and say, how many people of color am I close to? 3/4 of white people don't have one close black friend or minority friend at all. So ask yourself, what can I do to challenge myself in this area? How can I grow as a human being in a diverse world? Really making connections with people who are different, asking questions about them because you really want to learn and grow, not just as an intellectual curiosity. And I think that's some of the best ways we can get past these biases. And so, so it's a kind of a multi-pronged approach. I think there's experiential piece is huge. I think also learning about stereotypes and prejudice and biases is important too. And then looking for those things in your life and then like weeding them out as you see them. I have a colleague actually who's doing some research now where he's doing therapy with people who, who admit that they have racist thoughts and feelings that they don't want. And I think that that's really important and interesting work. So.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. It's very eye-opening for me as a Palestinian as well. I could relate to many of these stories that you or cases. But my comment or my question, which is they can be intertwined in a way, is it the system we are fighting to stop racism, or is it culture that embedded as a result of cultural experiences? We keep talking about racism incidents, and I follow the news how easy to kill an Afro-American in the street by police, even by black police sometimes. And that's the case. So are we fighting, of course, it's very complicated, uphill fights. I don't know if there's an end to racism as it is, but where this could start? Should we just go and analyze the institutionalization that produced such kind of mentality of division and discrimination, and that really instigate the easy behavior of a policeman over and employers to really carry on this stereotype and just follow this up? Are we blaming the wrong person, for example?
Yeah. So, I mean, you bring up like a really important point because racism, the way it operates, it's not just a few biased individuals who are going out there and doing bad things, right? It's all of the structures and institutions where these things are embedded. And so I think we absolutely have to look at our institutions and procedures and policies and ferret out all of the racism that's embedded in those as well. But it's sort of these individual attitudes and biases that keep that from happening. So I think the two of those things are linked. Does that answer your question? Thanks.
As there's been several attempts to have racism go into the DSM-5 in the past, how do you feel about the medicalization and the pathologizing of racism?
So you mean the effects of racism or people who are racist?
I think people were trying to put in that racism was something that you could be diagnosed with.
So being diagnosed from trauma due to racism.
No.
Oh, people who are
no,
racist.
there were actually people who are saying that's. I find it hard to believe that was even being put in the DSM-5. But I was just curious if you had heard about what you thought about that.
I've heard of that before, and I think don't know. It seems to me it would be really hard to figure out where that would go because it's not like an illness you come down with. It's kind of more like a personality disorder, but even that, I think it could be a personality disorder. I don't know. But I mean, that being said, I think it is something that can be corrected in people. So I'm optimistic that people can change. And personality disorders, sometimes we kind of throw our hands up. We're like, So I don't know.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really, really appreciated it. And I have a question about your thoughts about children of color adopted by white families and how they experience and react to and just deal with the issues of racism in the culture.
Yeah, that's a really important issue. And I mean, one of the things, for example, in black families, usually, not always, but usually there's a degree of what we call racial socialization that happens, where the parents sort of teach the kids about the realities of racism and what to do when you're pulled over by the police and why someone gave you that dirty look in the store and these kinds of things. And often when, kids of color are adopted by white parents, because if the white parents are not aware of those things, then they're not teaching their kids. And so what happens is these kids end up with no explanation for these experiences other than there must be something wrong with them. And these kids often end up very confused with very low self-esteem and depressed. So I think it's super important that that any white parents who are parenting kids of color go the extra mile to learn about the kid's culture and teach that to the kid and socialize them properly and make sure that there are lots of people of color in that kid's life who can also support and guide them through that process of being a person of color in America.